The uncertainty and the undesirability to invest in the future of oil has created a situation where we have an underinvestment, and our production capabilities do not exceed the amount of demand we have in the current world. So in this video, I'll be discussing the 5 primary reasons why the oil price will continue to skyrocket through the next few years, and if you watch this entire thing, you'll have a firm understanding of what to expect in the future. Before I jump into the reasons, I think it's really important to understand that there's a core concept that a lot of people, I think, misunderstand, and that is that these oil companies really want super insanely inflated oil prices. While it's true that they generate more profits with extremely high oil prices, the fact of the matter is that it actually creates something called demand destruction. Most of the companies have a break-even point of $35 to $45 per barrel of oil. That means that if they sell oil at around the $90 mark, they're making excess profits, they're able to pay down incredible debts and return a ton of value to their shareholders. Any oil price in excess of that actually creates demand destruction, which essentially means that people will find alternative ways to travel. They'll, refrain from filling their gas tank. They'll start riding their bike to work. They'll find ways to reduce their overall gas intake, which overall is a good thing, right? That's a good thing. We want to move towards that. But it's also important to understand that these companies do try and control the oil price up and down to some extent via the release of their reserves. And the problem is that they're running out of these reserves and their production is not capable of generating these reserves. And that's why you're seeing the current supply crisis that we're facing. And on that note, the first primary reason why you're seeing a massive increase to the price of oil is because of US shale production. Unlike in the past, US shale is not chasing the oil price by ramping up their production to unprecedented levels. In fact, they can't. They are marginally increasing production as they can, but realistically, the reduction in capital expenditure for new drills has created a situation where they are way behind their ability to generate additional production to take advantage of the increased oil price. There's a couple reasons for this. The first is that chasing production can actually crash the market as it has in the past. If these companies generate too much oil, what ends up happening is that they actually crash the value of the commodity by flooding the market with additional product. The second part is that they actually cannot increase production because even if they wanted to increase production, those projects take years to come online. And even if they started today, you're not going to see any benefit for years to come. And the global oil reserves are already getting pounded. So therefore, by the time their increased production projects come online, it's already too late and the price of oil has already skyrocketed. Oil production projects take years to come online, from the exploration to the planning to the engineering to the construction to finally the drilling. It can take a significant period of time before any well actually produces any oil. The other element to US shale production is the fact, and I know a lot of people are going to hate me saying this, but you have shareholders making demands of CEOs to not increase production too far because they don't want the oil price to completely crash. What they want is these companies to generate additional profits and then they want to return those profits to shareholders. In fact, a spokesperson for Pioneer said exactly that they are very aware of the commodity price, and they're actually not going to completely increase the production because they don't want to crash the commodity. These CEOs make a ton of money, and they don't want to be outside of their extremely high-paying jobs because they did exactly the opposite of what their shareholders wanted. The second reason why oil prices will continue to skyrocket over the next few years is because of OPEC's spare capacity. A lot of people have this impression that OPEC, including Saudi Arabia, are sitting on an incredible amount of reserves and their production capabilities, and they're actually withholding it on purpose in order to facilitate a higher oil price. While the OPEC nations most certainly curtail production in order to keep an oil price at a consistent level, the truth of the matter is that they have continued to increase production over the last several months to the point where they're actually starting to exhaust their productive capabilities. OPEC increasing their production quotas makes no difference if their membership countries are not capable of actually producing enough oil to meet those quotas, which is exactly what's happening in Angola and Nigeria. Both of these countries are giving up hundreds of millions of dollars of oil production per month, and not because they want to, it's because they have no choice. They quite literally cannot generate the productive capacity to meet their quotas. In fact, even before the war with Ukraine, it was believed that Russia was actually hitting their capacity production limits as well with regards to oil. So even with the world's Russian oil supply in circulation, we would still be heading towards a significant oil deficit. The inability for OPEC and its membership nations to increase their productive capacity, without question, is one of the biggest things pulling up the price of oil. The third reason why oil will continue to skyrocket in price is because there is a chronic underinvestment in oil production worldwide, and this is dating back almost a decade. Let's be honest, we all know that we need to move away from fossil fuels in order to keep Mother Nature alive and well, and that's something we should all be supporting. But that push that we've placed in social media and on governments has created a chronic underinvestment in oil, which we are now seeing the effects of. Over the past decade, there has been a significant reduction in capital expenditure being placed in the infrastructure of oil. In fact, the capital expenditure of oil infrastructure peaked in 2014 and has since been on an absolutely steady decline. In fact, that exactly correlates with the decline of oil production that we're seeing today. There's actually a couple factors that play here. The first is that these companies in shareholder meetings are discussing the idea that it's actually difficult for them to get funding for major projects because banks and other financial institutions do not want to see that they are helping kind of a dirty industry continue to produce oil. So these oil companies are getting less than favorable rates as they try to get funding for their CapEx projects. In addition to that, projects are taking longer to get approved, and even if they do get approved through the entire political process while facing an extreme amount of social pushback, you run the risk of these projects getting canceled, like the Keystone XL pipeline. So these companies are having a hard time legitimately investing in oil infrastructure. Many governments have pledged to net zero by 2050, which is an absolutely fantastic thing and something we should all be supporting. But we also have to understand that this pressure makes it very difficult for these oil companies to invest in their future production. And therefore, we're putting ourselves in a situation where we have a commodity that we actually need, but we're telling that we don't want, and therefore they don't increase production, and then we find ourselves in a situation where there's a scarcity of the commodity and the oil price skyrockets. And with this drive towards net zero in 2050, there have been significant governmental policy changes around the world that have made it increasingly more difficult for these companies to increase their production. So even if they wanted to increase their production, which many of them actually do, they can't because there are so many hurdles in the way from a social standpoint and a governmental standpoint that prevent them from increasing their production notably. And to top it all off, COVID hits. And with COVID, the oil price actually hit a negative value for the first time in history, which is absolutely insane and put these oil companies under significant pressure. And what happens? They have to pull back their production. They have to curtail their investment strategies. They have to curtail their investment in future infrastructure because they didn't know how long the lockdowns are going to occur. They didn't know how long the demand destruction of oil was going to occur. So they had to play it smart to stay alive. And now, as we discussed prior, it takes years for new projects to come online. And when you have the social pressures, the governmental pressures, and then COVID, suddenly you're in a situation where these oil companies simply cannot produce enough oil to meet the demand. As an aside, I do think it's incredibly important that we move towards a future of utilizing renewable energy sources. However, the problem we currently face and the reason why the oil price is so high is that idealistic idea of moving towards renewable right now is not possible. We have too much of a reliance on the energy produced by hydrocarbons in order to move to a completely renewable future. It's simply not possible. And as a result, we're going to have a much longer transition, not in years, but rather in decades before hydrocarbons are simply not part of our energy grid. And the fourth reason why the oil price will continue to skyrocket, and you're not going to believe this, but the demand of oil worldwide is actually increasing year over year and is projected to do so for at least a decade. If you think about it, this actually makes a lot of sense. In developed nations, it's hard enough to transition to a renewable future. For instance, we do have access to solar panels and electric cars, but both of which are both extremely prohibitively expensive and difficult to come by, with months and months and perhaps years of waiting to actually acquire those technologies. The result is that the transition is taking longer than we would hope. And it is increasingly prohibitive because some people just simply can't afford to buy an electric vehicle if they wanted to, despite more coming out every single year. This issue is compounded in developing nations who cannot afford the cost of an electric vehicle or solar panels or the infrastructure for electric renewable facilities. The result of which is you have these people who are trying to increase their living standards and they have to rely on oil. They have no choice. And it's not fair for anyone else in the world who might have access to greater renewable technologies to say, hey, we want to cut oil out, so your living standard needs to go down. That's not fair, and no one's going to accept that. So the result is that the demand of oil continues to increase. Another factor that we often fail to identify is that in developing nations, you often have faster population growth. That increased population over time needs to be supported by energy, and the only true energy that they currently have available to them are hydrocarbons. Even Elon Musk, a pioneer in renewable technologies with Tesla, agrees that we need to somehow increase oil production in order to actually curtail the price of oil. But the realistic truth is, as we've mentioned prior, that's simply not possible. Our demand on oil worldwide continues to increase and will be year over year for some time. Unfortunately, our productive capacities make it so that our supply cannot meet that demand. And reason number 5, while we'll continue to see an increase in oil prices, is, well, quite frankly, that we're way more reliant on oil than you think. Speaking in a general sense, there is a wide misunderstanding as to how oil is utilized in the world and how it impacts our day-to-day lives. In fact, recent estimations show that approximately 60% of oil is committed to the use of transportation, with the remaining 40% to be used for other applications. So even if everyone in the world is driving an electric car and we're flying in electric planes, and of course we're assuming that the power grid doesn't need hydrocarbons, there's still a significant demand for oil for these other applications. Where's that 40% of oil usage going towards? Well, it's pretty much everywhere. Every single plastic you see, the fertilizers you use, and even the damn tires on your electric car. It's also worth noting that the price of oil and energy has a direct impact on the agricultural sector. Energy use is required in developing and producing food, the result of which is as hydrocarbon costs increase, so will the price of food. And finally, in this next video, I'm going to be showing you the best environmentally friendly investment in oil you can make. So if you're interested in investing in oil, but want to make sure that you're taking care of Mother Earth, you've got to watch this next video. We'll see you there.